Well, hey there, and welcome to episode number 520 of 6 Pixels of Separation, the Mirum Podcast. My name is Mitch Joel. It's Sunday, June 26th, 2016. Let's get on with the show. So who are you and what do you do?
I'm Nancy Duarte, and I run a communication firm in the Silicon Valley.
And there's someone else.
I'm Patti Sanchez. I'm Nancy's partner in crime at Duarte and also co-author of the latest book.
Illuminate.
That's it.
Okay, good. I was worried that your Skype dumped on you, but no, you're waiting for me to fill in the blanks here, which is, I think it speaks to the power of the title, where I immediately I can come to it the second you guys talk about what's the title of the new book. So this is a really interesting book, and I guess Nancy, I'll start with you. You've been on the show from early days, I think from the Slideology days and to Resonate, and I think we even did a chat around the HBR guide to persuasive presentations. Is this a culmination? Is this something completely new? Are you entering into new territory? Are you trying to bring it together for modern times? What's happening here?
Yeah, what's interesting is like every book I write is a prequel to the other one, and it's interesting when you start to really get deep into communication and storytelling, you start to realize that it is, a tool that leaders need to use effectively to really bring about the kind of transformations that we need in business and society right now. So, obviously Slideology was about making better presentations. Resonate was about infusing storytelling practices into how you communicate. And what was happening is we got great work where people were like, hey, I have a presentation I need done in a few weeks. Can you help me? And then the conversation changed to, hey, I need this presentation, but it's actually one piece of a bigger movement. And so that's when Patti and I jumped in and we started to really look at both business and social movements. We looked at epic length tales. We really dug in and tried to see what is it really that a leader needs as they're trying to communicate in a way that's transformative. And that's where Illuminate came from.
And so what brought Patti into the process?
So when she first started 5 years ago, she just had her 5-year anniversary, I had told her the premise for Resonate was originally that I believed that businesses, if the business is the protagonist in a story, they go through transformations just like a protagonist does in a regular story. So I knew that there were plots, that businesses follow story plots, and that there was a finite set of one. And she's like, that's a really good book idea still, because that was the premise I wanted to Resonate with, and Resonate went a different direction. And I said, well, I'm not going to write that book alone. You're going to have to write it with me, because between the two of us, we're like a 80-year-old's worth of talent and experience. And so it was really just natural to kind of identify the story plots that need to be told so people can cope with change.
And Patti, when you have that conversation with Nancy, in your brain, are you saying something like, I wasn't thinking in that direction, or yeah, that's clear, but the world doesn't know that? Like, where are you sort of figuring in how you're going to weave your narrative into that?
Yeah, I knew it was true on some intuitive level, but nobody had really codified it in that way in the business world, and so I knew it'd be quite a spelunking expedition to try and figure out what the architecture of those kinds of stories is. But I also knew, because as Nancy said, I'm super old, I've been in technology marketing way too long, and so I've seen a lot of products move through their life cycle, from the initial stage of birth all the way to their decrepit old age. And I had a hunch that the stories would be different depending at least on the life cycle of the product or of the idea. And that was where I entered and the premise that I had in mind. And as we started to research, like Nancy said, social movements, business initiatives of all kinds, we realized that there actually is a shape to all of them. And it's not really necessarily just the life cycle of the idea, but it's that journey that everyone who's carrying that idea forward has to undergo.
So I love writing books, which I know to a lot of people sounds very sadistic. Most people dread the process of having to get it all down. And then when you couple in a co-author, to me, it's like this perfect, you're creating a perfect storm for divorce and anger and resentment in the end. And then I love how all the forwards are like, I could never have done it without you. You're the breath between mine and wing. Did you guys kill each other? Be honest.
No, what's funny is I talk about Patti publicly so fondly people think we're in a relationship. Because it's like, oh my God. So we're so opposite that I don't think that book would have become what it was. So I'm kind of black and white. I see this future. We have to get there. Everything's urgent. And Patty's like an empath. And if you look that up, it's like someone with supernatural ability to be empathetic. And she just approached everything from this perspective that actually literally made me come to a screeching halt and consider that, oh my God, there really might be an alternative perspective to mine. Which is so funny to me. But we had a blast. We laughed. We cried. We got to points of exhaustion that there really are no words that could explain. And then you go through the exact storyline where there were moments where we were like, can we both keep going? Do we have the energy to actually complete this work? Not because of tension between us, but because of the volume of work it is to put 4 years into something. We're just not the type of people that could be like, I could write a book in 6 weeks. That's not something to congratulate yourself about. Like, we try to do really thoughtful, new insights, something nobody's ever thought of before. Then we also look to make sure it can be backed with research, So it it was awesome. I wouldn't trade those 4 years for anything in the world.
All right, Patti.
Neither would I.
Hold on, Patti. I've known Nancy forever, so let's pretend like she's not here. You're now co-authoring a book. You're co-authoring a book with your boss. I mean, this is like, to me, like when I hear all these things, I'm like, did Patti sleep at all in this process? Was she? I mean, there's a lot of stuff at stake because it can. I mean, look, it's emotional. It's very personal. Everybody wants it to be the best it's going to be. Nancy's done too. She's got both a pedigree and recognition. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's sort of stacked against someone coming into this.
You're exactly right about that. And if you really want to know if I slept or not, you could ask my actual life partner. I think he would tell you I didn't sleep a ton and I wasn't very available on the weekends for a pretty long period of time. So yeah, the effort is hard. There's a lot of work to do, and also the stakes were high. But I also I can't discount Nancy's generosity of spirit. The fact that she is so willing to make herself vulnerable to seek opinions from many different sources and to be able to embrace those opinions, she made it easy for me. In that respect, she made it hard for me in some other respects because the way that she writes is very different. Her process is different than mine, so that took some adjusting too.
Yeah, and that to me is the biggest thing. I've been approached and even went down the road of potentially co-authoring a book, and I just felt like stylistically, it's really hard to get their words to either not sound like mine, but that middle road. Yeah. I found that part so hard.
Yeah. I think it was hard initially because we do speak in different voices, we're different personalities, but by the end of the process, we had spent so much time together, a couple of years of many waking hours, that we almost took on each other's qualities to a certain degree, and we could start to answer questions the same way. We still do. I mean, she goes and tells people that her favorite movie is Amadeus, which is my favorite movie. So
she's just stealing your stuff now, yeah.
Exactly. No, I mean, seriously, it was an amazing experience, and I would do it over again, and I think we're actually going to do it over again very soon because we've got another book idea in us.
Patti's been writing for 20 years, so she was a stronger writer. So I had to up my game. Like, she produced something, I'm like, that was way more awesome than what I just did, and then I would go back and rework mine. But my process, to use Dan Rome's metaphor, I'm a hummingbird. I'll hop around. Well, let's test these models. Let's just flick them out there partially baked, and Patti's like, no, they need to be finely formed, So I'll iterate quickly on loose concepts, and she wants to go deep. She's a fox, and she could go deep, and then she could write for days and find her insight through her writing. And I was like, let's just flick it out. Let's just flick some stuff around and see what sticks. So it was that part was probably harder on her than me by far. because I'm used to being a hummingbird. And
I always have I always have the same reactions when I read books that now I'll call that come out of the Duarte Empire is what I'm going to say now, because we just we're not going to do like a pre-Patti or post. We're just going to consider they're all part of the same family. I read these books, and again, Nancy knows I've been speaking professionally for over 10 years, and I read your books, and I always say the same thing. I always go like, I can't believe people don't do this. And then I read the book, and then I think to myself, I can't believe I don't do this all the time. Like it's like this weird thing where the content makes so much sense, and it's so clear that there's a frustration that I have for the general industry, and then I have a personal frustration because even if it's a simple presentation or simple story I have to tell, I'm like, why don't I break out the structure? What's wrong with me?
It's work. I think we forget, right? I think there's two things that we kind of naturally lag on. We forget that we want to communicate what we have to convey and just get it out of us so we can pronounce it to the world instead of thinking about who's on the receiving end, because it's harder to get there that way. And then the amount of work it takes to actually communicate effectively is more work than I think. People are so pressed for time. They don't want to put the time into it. And so when people come through like a workshop here, they'll be like, oh, doing it right is a lot of work. Yeah, doing it right is a lot of work. But once it becomes a discipline, then it becomes kind of like breathing. It becomes more natural.
And Patti, from your side, my understanding of your role, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you're also helping the clients almost formulate strategically why they're even doing this stuff in the first place?
Yeah. Essentially, I'm engaging early in the process to help them think through, fundamentally, who are they trying to win over, and how do they need to do that, and what do they need to say to make that happen? And so my role in doing that was also the perfect petri dish for trying out these ideas as we were writing the book and testing whether they would really work. And we did the same for our own business too, because I also helped play that role to a certain extent here at Duarte. So it was nice to be able to rapidly prototype the ideas and make sure that they're sound during the process of writing the book too.
I recently had a conversation for 6 Pixels where I was talking to someone who had sold literally millions upon millions of books, and they've consecutively done that. It's this amazing story of how they done, and they wrote a book on how to make what they called a saleable book, not a sellable book, but a saleable book. And one of the sort of little nuggets that they dropped was writing a book has nothing to do with selling a book. And it was like really like one of those moments where you realize, like, you sort of shrug your shoulders and go, why didn't I think of that? It's such a good sort of thought. And as I was going through Illuminate, it became really obvious to me that having a vision actually has very little to do with how you communicate it. Like, those are also can be two very diametrically opposed thoughts. Some companies have great visions. They have no idea how to communicate it. And the art of communicating that vision is completely different than the fact that they have one.
Wow, that is so true. And it's almost like the art of creating a product is entirely different than marketing the product. You have the inspiration as a leader to take your business in a particular direction, and you have certainty based on your experience and the clarity of your thinking that that's the right thing to do. But yet, just because it's a great idea doesn't mean that everyone's going to embrace it. The same thing is true with products. Just because it's a great product that does all the things it should do doesn't mean that people are going to be compelled to buy it. So that's actually the distinction between the two is actually what we want to address to a certain degree in the next book, because developing your ability to, as a leader, to clarify your vision, to actually have a unique idea is quite different than persuading people to buy into it, as you said.
So talk a bit, Nancy, about how those narratives come closer together, because that actually is the business that I think all of us are actually in. We might have different tactics to do that, but that is the business all of us here on this conversation, I'm sure most people listening to us are basically in, is how do you bring those ideas closer, because communicating is an art form.
Yeah, it is. I think it's a science and an art somewhat. I think it's really it is several things. It does have to do with the idea itself and the leader, but really, if you have two products that are equal in all features and everything, people will buy the product that they have a stronger emotional attachment to. I mean, it'll inch out the other one by a lot sometimes. And I think that when you declare a dream and you say, I have this different ideal of the future for all of us, it's a weird reaction. Your more adventurous ones will jump in and others will just stand by and wish it to fail. And the communicator needs to understand the polarity of the reaction that anyone's going to have to their idea, because there's an emotional polarity there about some people will become entrenched and other people will be excited by it. And it is the leader's role to understand both reactions and then weave them together in a way that warns the ones that want to be complacent and motivates the ones that want to be actively engaged. So that's why, there's motivating speeches and warning speeches, there's motivating stories and warning stories, and there's motivating ceremonies and warning ceremonies, because they need to know when to turn one on and turn one off. And that's what the effective communicators will do.
The other side of it, and Patty, I'm curious about your side of this from the strategic sense, is a lot of times there's a vision, and it's a clear vision, and it's a strong vision, but it may not be that innovative. It may not be that dent in the universe. But yet they have to be able to communicate that in an efficient, professional, in a complementary cultural way to their team. So the torchbearer has to bring it down to those people.
Right, absolutely. And find the piece, I think, as Nancy was saying, that has meaning for those other people that they can connect to. And clarity is one challenge, just being able to articulate it clearly enough that people can understand it. But the other job that the leader has to do is to figure out what deeper need those people inside your organization or outside your organization have that this vision will satisfy. So really, it's almost a matter of translating it into the language that your employees or that your customers, your partners speak, and the things that will really be relevant to them. And that's where empathy comes in. And if a leader doesn't have a natural ability to understand or even curiosity about how other people see the world, then they're really going to struggle with that translation act. And then that's the role that the communicator as counselor really has to play. Ask questions, serve up insight to the leader about what the people need to hear so that they can latch onto and carry this idea forward.
Talk a little bit more about the translation, because I think about that a lot when I present. Like, how is this information going, especially when you're doing it actually in a group where it's not one company, it could be an association, so there's many representatives from different companies. But the translation part I find really interesting, because you'll present the idea, it will be bold, it'll follow the roadmap, people will applaud, they'll stand up, they will send gifts and, offer up parts of their body for me to autograph. It's fantastic. I'm telling you. I kid. I'm kidding.
I'm so glad you remember that, Mitch.
Exactly.
So happy.
But what happens is when you step off stage and you engage, there is a lot of translation that's taking part. And what I mean by that is taking it further when we changed our name, let's say from Twist Image to Mirum, or when we get acquired by WPP, and you're sort of telling the team in a very transparent and honest way and following all the rules, why we did it, this is the journey, this is where we're going. The translation that I always feel, the struggle, is that they still go back to their desk and go and think to themselves, like, what does this really mean to me? We're going to do all these new services, we're going to do all this stuff, but great speech, great vision, we believe, but right. Like they get scared. It's normal.
Right, exactly. I mean, that is how humans respond to change. And I think we have to take responsibility for that. As the leaders, if they don't get excited about it and can't apply it right away, then we haven't finished the job by making it relevant to them. And that's why, in a lot of ways, I fundamentally disagree that there is a story. There's an overarching narrative about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and where it's going to take you in the end. At the same time, really, you have to tell many versions of that story. You have to say, all right, to my engineering team, this is what the vision will look like. To my service team, this is what the vision will look like, and so on, in ad nauseum for all the audiences that you have to persuade. You have to be willing to do that work so that they can understand what's being asked of them and also see themselves in it. And so that's really the biggest part of the job. And if you don't do that, then they're going to resist, no doubt about it. Or at the very least, they're going to be apathetic and just not even care.
So what I'm seeing a lot of, and I'm curious for your immediate reaction, and Nancy, we'll start with you, is I feel like every time I'm either watching a YouTube video or even I'm invited to speak and watching the other speakers go, which can be at a larger companies or smaller companies for summit or whatever it might be, every single one is trying to do one of three things, or all three at the same time. They're trying to be Steve Jobs, they're trying to be Apple, or they're trying to be Ted, or they're trying to do it all at the same time.
Yeah.
Is that a good thing or a terrible thing? I can't decide.
It's funny because, Apple and Ted, I mean, they really have helped set a bar for how people present. And, you never, I mean, if you had closed your eyes and dreamed of what company would win a Peabody Award, you would never guess one that distributes presentations, Ted. I mean, they won a Peabody Award. That's amazing. So that's a real tribute to the power of the spoken word and, what a great job it can do. But sometimes I think when people are trying to mimic someone else, they're not their true self. And I think that comes through. I think finally now Tim Cook is his true self. I think at first he was trying to mimic Steve a bit, it was like, be yourself. And he's coming into his own skin, and that's really been really lovely to see. So I don't think it's a bad thing to study great communicators, because Dr. King, I mean, there's just some go-to people you go to when you're wanting to be a student of great communication, but you should take the findings from them, but not try to be them. And I think that's where you would have to draw the line.
Patti?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And, I've been talking a lot about understanding your audience, but also you have to understand yourself and what a win looks like for you and what your style is as a communicator. And so in the book, Illuminate, we talk about all these communication tools that great torchbearers use, like Steve Jobs, like Martin Luther King Jr., things like speeches and stories and ceremonies. And they all had a different flavor based on the personality of that leader. And they all have a vernacular that they're a little more comfortable with. Dr. King was an incredible orator, and he told stories sometimes, but his real power was in the speech making. And he also used ceremonies, but every leader has sort of a different sweet spot, and it's okay to major in that form of communication that you're most expert at, that feels most comfortable to you. So I would say, find your voice and also use the medium that you are most comfortable in as the place you ground yourself.
What do you mean by that? Because the medium to me is you got to get up on stage. Maybe there's slides, maybe there aren't.
Well, I guess what I mean by that is when I look at I'm talking about the communication tools that we talk about in Illuminate, which is almost like presentations deconstructed. And in some cases, you may give a formal speech on stage to a large audience, but in other cases, part of your persuasion job will be to have small group conversations, one-on-one conversations, where you have to explain your vision to people. Like one of the leaders we talk about in the book, Ray Anderson of Interface. He did a lot of one-on-one coalition building to try and win support for this massive sustainability vision that he had for his company. And one of the things that he did frequently in those conversations is he drew a sketch of a mountain that symbolized the objective they were trying to accomplish. And he used that visual communication repeatedly to explain the vision and how hard it was going to be to achieve. And it wasn't a formal slide presentation because it didn't make sense in that setting, but also it was a vernacular, it was a language that he could communicate very confidently in. I'm going to draw a picture and I'm going to just tell you about my strategy very casually. And he did that over and over, and it worked well for him.
I believe one of the greater failings of a lot of people that I would actually consider to be fairly significant leaders or chiefs of an industry is that they don't spend enough time thinking or doing this stuff. And I guess it's easy for me to be an armchair quarterback, and it's not going to be something either of you are going to disagree on, because you've built a business on hoping that people are like that so that you can train them and help them be better. But I'm almost baffled by a lot of leaders' inability to get up and cogently and convincingly really deliver a message. And I think Steve Jobs was masterful in a pool of people who really were inefficient, if you know what I mean. Like, I think he was great. I mean, I'm not dismissing anything he did, but it's not like we've all seen way better public speakers than that. It's just from what he did with business and those assets, he was able to push it beyond what just is typically usually really hard to do for most people, for most business leaders.
He put a lot of time into it. I think that's just a little known fact, right? I mean, weeks before launch, everything had to be pixel perfect. Thousands of slides were made, only a handful selected, and blah, blah, blah. It's just like, wow. Just cared. I mean, that was a primary marketing mechanism for them. Millions of people around the world would tune in, so it became their differentiator on how they marketed themselves, too. But it takes a commitment, a fierce commitment to do it really well. And I think he had that.
Yeah. Patti, what are your thoughts on just that moment where you have somebody who can pull it together, but even, like, again, from my perspective, I don't look at it as masterful. I look at it as masterful in the sea of so many who were just so below par also. Am I being am I like being too negative on the dead? I'm not sure. Like, too soon? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, I would agree with what Nancy said earlier, is that, not everybody can be that person. And TED presentation set a really high bar, but everybody doesn't have to be able to communicate on that level to be persuasive. You have to definitely be able to articulate your ideas well, and using storytelling principles, you can express those ideas in a more emotionally engaging way. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be the showman at the pinnacle of Steve Jobs to be effective as a communicator.
So talk a little bit about, so one of the words that I love that you guys use a lot is this idea of conviction, right? This idea that it's never going to work unless you have that component both internally and how the message is conveyed. I think it's such a fine line between conviction and overacting that sometimes even when you've got that conviction, it doesn't parlay to the audience because you're either under-rehearsed and so you're overcompensating, or you're sometimes over-rehearsed and you're overacting. I mean, I see that a lot. I don't know. Patti, Nancy?
Well, I guess really it feels to me like what you're touching on is inauthenticity. And sometimes coaches will say, like you said, we'll give people advice, speakers advice about actions they can perform, stances that they can take while they're presenting that will give the illusion of confidence or authority, when the audience can smell that speaker doesn't actually believe what they're saying. And so no amount of power gestures is going to make up for that. And so when we work with executives and coach them on how to present in a really critical moment, we start with, what are you really passionate about? What do you believe? And even if it's someone else's vision and you're the mid-level manager who has to show support for it, find the thing in it that you personally connect with and communicate from that place. And of course, that might mean incorporating a personal story or changing the content in some way so that you can be speaking with more authority about the things that you really believe in. But I think what we're really talking about is authenticity, about a leader being truthful about their what they believe in, what their passion is, and letting that show through. And that's a lot more persuasive than acting. Yeah,
it's funny. When I started speaking and I took my first gig incredibly seriously, I worked with stand-up comedians and presentation coaches and all different stuff because I really wanted to. I thought this could be an avenue for me, and it turned out that was good and it worked out well. I was really fascinated with the sort of the being yourself stuff. It's like you feel when you're up there like you have to be this persona, this strong character. And what took me years to get, and I'm sure you see this in the nuances of when you're coaching and helping people build their presentations out, is that conviction doesn't equal X, Y, Z. Conviction partially has a huge component of just like the natural state of how you talk and communicate that vision.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, I think like a personal story told with a sense of ownership, that you own the story. And that a lot of times means you have to stand up and say you failed. That's what a story would do, right? It's like, look, we can't go this direction because I've gone this direction before. I'm telling you, we need to take a left turn right now. That's so different than someone who's trying to say, I've never failed. I'm perfect. We both, Mitch, go to TED. And I remember I was at a dinner and I'm like saying, what do you guys, especially the long time TEDsters, what do you miss? And I remember they're like, everything's so polished and fake. I'm looking for that geeky scientist who looks like they're about to pee their pants on the stage, but they're so freaking brilliant. And we're not trying to shape them into something they're not. They're a terrified geeky scientist, I thought that was interesting how they were just craving human, a flawed human to get up and talk about great science, But
so also part of it, go ahead. No, I was just saying, but part of it is just that it became, it is somewhat formulaic, right? It's like 15 minutes stand up, tell that personal story that's awkward, that you can't connect to. You make your statement, you give an example or two, then you wrap it up. I mean, it makes it hard to have that authentic voice.
Yeah, I think that there's a moment where the presenter themselves has to have a personal breakthrough. You can only rehearse so much, and then you have to just throw your cares to the wind and just stand there from a place that's not in your head, but it's in your heart. It comes somewhere between your chest cavity and your tummy. There's this place you speak from that I call it
sometimes
my place
lower.
of conviction. Yeah. You might speak there, but I don't speak from there. But there's this place of great conviction where you can feel it. I can actually feel it when I'm using my head or when I'm using my heart, right? And it's just like almost like I'm communicating from a different place. And I think that, we need to learn to do that.
So talk about, I'm really fascinated with visual storytelling because I feel like it's something that's been a part of our culture for so long, even back to the tribal years, but it feels almost recently, and I think a lot of it's the work that you guys have been doing, it's just so phenomenal, have really have elevated almost to this point of being tremendously important in how we communicate. Are you surprised by the adoption of this? Like, if I go back several years, early years of Slideology even, Nancy, and it was like that to bullet points, right? Remember that? And when I look around, it's like, I'm like, wow, like I don't see many bullet points anymore. Like I'm fascinated by that.
I know. I love it. I love that that's happening. But the interesting thing is, we went back to the future, like back when they made 35 millimeter slides and people ran around with slide carousels. They were beautiful. And it was done by tradesmen, people who'd been honed in the craft, and they were graphic designers. And then PowerPoint and Keynote came out, and every user was suddenly a graphic designer, but they're not, And so I think the infusing basic design language with business language was what helped change the tide. Now, that said, in our practice, about 75% of all presentations made are actually made to be documents. It's the poor man's, PowerPoint is the poor man's InDesign, right? It's like that's what they use to be visual communicators. So we did, as a companion to Slideology, wrote another piece called a slide doc, and it was a free book I did a couple years ago. And it's slidedoc.com or slidedocs.com, and basically it's giving everyone permission. Sorry about that. You can go make your dense slides. I've named the enemy. I gave it a name. It's called a slide doc, but it's a different set of rules. You need to make it like it's a document. It's basically like you've had a design firm, an organization, and everyone used to do collateral. People don't do collateral anymore because PowerPoint has become the collateral making mechanism for that. So what we did is we've polarized it. As you say, you're giving a presentation, then it needs to be highly conceptual visual story. You're using PowerPoint to create a document, then it needs to be dense. Put more words on it, not less, and distribute it like it's a document. And so there has been definitely, we've driven a big wide gap, which is great because now there's two forms under which you should use presentation software for. And it's really changing. It's really rocking industry because what was happening is people needed to create a dense document, and then we're getting all kinds of crap like, well, where's your metaphor of a kitty? You can't have a dense document.
Or the clients wanted it. The clients wanted more detail. Like that was, I think you and I actually did a podcast when Slide Docs came out, and that was my sort of like pushback / provocation was, clients are asking for this now. I want more dense slides. And like, what?
Yeah. So when a slide can, run around, when a slide can move around an organization without a presenter, you've made a slide doc. If you need a presenter to be there with it, then you've made slides. And so, so it is. We are trying to make room for all forms of communication that people are using the tool for, but the visualization of a concept is very important, because if I can see what you're saying and you could draw it, then we have alignment, or I can contest it. I can say, no, Mitch, it's a 4-part structure and you only drew 3 parts here, or whatever. We at least can collaborate around a picture and say, yes, I agree, or no, I don't, or yes, I'm aligned with that, or no, I'm not. So it is drawing a line in the sand to rally people around, which is very important in business. We're moving so quickly. So if there's anything that can be verbally said that can be a picture instead, you get alignment quicker.
So one of the you did this so well. You talk about the 4 tools: deliver speeches, tell stories, hold ceremonies, and use symbols. And I thought that you used symbols in your book incredibly well. And the one that obviously pops to my brain is the notion of the torchbearer. I'm wondering, I love moments like that, and I'm always curious like how moments like that come together. So be honest, who came up with the torchbearer and how did it happen? Don't say we were brainstorming.
Ooh, it was in a vision. It came down from heaven. No. We actually wrote a very different book. We did a first pass on this book, and we knew we didn't want to necessarily use the word leader, because you would be stunned to see how many people self-select out of leadership, because they're like, oh no, I'm not a leader, I'm just this, or whatever. And so we were like, well, what can we have that's kind of aspirational for the name of the leader? And we didn't want to use leader and follower. So in the first pass of the book, we called the followers the troops. And people were like, why do you have such a military metaphor? Troops, leader and troops, And we hated it. I mean, we hated troops, but we didn't want to say it was employees, because it wasn't employees. It's customers. It can be partners. It could be your banker. I mean, who knows who you're trying to persuade. So we didn't want it to be leader and follower either. And so we were in a brainstorm with one of Patti's guys, and he brought up the concept of a torch bearer. And we had played around with, we spent a lot of time with Frodo, and we liked the idea that he was a ring bearer, and he had to step up and lead. He had to choose to carry the ring. And something about a bearer, it's a mantle that you choose to accept or you choose to not carry it. And we really liked that concept of being a bearer, asking to bear something, because so many choose not to bear anything. And when you think about what's the situations under which I would use a torch, well, usually it's very dark and possibly very scary, and you're lacking maybe some resources or whatever. But a torch isn't like a searchlight. A torch just lights up the next few steps. And that's what a leader does. They dissipate enough fear to make people want to say, oh, I could go there. I can do that, and that's what a leader does. And so the metaphor stuck, and that's why we have the torchbearers and their travelers. A lot of it was kind of it was inspired a bit by Lord of the Rings in the sense that that's what Frodo had. Yeah, Frodo had his little travelers that came along with him, and he wouldn't have made it without them. So
I thought it was really great. And again, that idea of travelers too. It's there's often not enough good vernacular when we talk about business, and you're right, we tend to use these militaristic terms that they always turn me off. We're going to attack or kill our opponents.
Right. I mean, that notion of the traveler is another empathetic device to help a leader see that why are people resisting this idea I'm trying to get them to buy into. We're restructuring. I've got this new strategy. It makes perfect sense. Why? Well, because you're asking them to go somewhere they've never been before. They've not existed in this environment. They haven't lived in a world where that strategy was true. Right? So the metaphorically, traveling to a place you've never been to before is frightening. And liken it to the explorers in the Age of Discovery. Hundreds of years ago, it took incredible guts. I mean, wow, I almost want to say balls. Sorry. But
we apologize,
But, for those explorers to choose to go off the map, to travel to a place that had never been described before. And that's effectively what you're asking people to do for you in your organization or out there in the marketplace. So I think if you see things from that perspective, you can start to understand a little bit why they might dig their heels in and think differently about how you want to make it less scary for them.
It's so funny too, because as I was going through the content of the book and really, the breakdown of the dream, leap, fight, climb, arrive, and then dream/redream, I thought, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to have a chance to speak to Nancy and Patti, and it's going to be all about why are presentations like this and why is it so popular? Because I'm such a presentation nerd by default, and I just default because I'm like, well, I have the experts who do this for a living. But the other side of me was like, oh my goodness, this book really is a book about leadership and about management. And it sort of took me aback because one is I wasn't expecting that, and two is, I'm a big believer in Joseph Conrad and the hero's journey, and I know it's definitely impacted the flow of the work that you do, Duarte, for obvious reasons. And I felt like it finally came together, those concepts with leadership and management. Like this book, I just want to I have 3 other business partners. Here, you got to read this. You got to read this. And it's not really about presidents, or it's it fascinates me that it opened up a lot more. Where I thought this is what great leaders need to hear.
We intentionally wanted to try to come up with a tool of empathy to get leaders to see things from a different perspective. Okay. And most of my books have been for oh my God, I have a talk to do. I'm going to run to Nancy's books. And so we worried a lot about, because now we're appealing to a different audience, really, than traditionally we've appealed to. And I'm thrilled that you can see the roots in story. And we're starting to see transformation within leaders. And you've worked for other people, and now you've worked for yourself for a while. And you know that sometimes the people who do sign up to jump in and lead are the ones that sometimes are the least self-aware. And this book will help people see things from another perspective that they hadn't considered. It's like an orienteering device. It'll orient them.
Yeah, it's got
their situation.
You're right. It has a bit of a compass feel. It absolutely does.
Yeah.
The other funny thing is, we've been chatting now for about 40 minutes, and before we wrap up, we talk a lot about big names and big brands and big people who have delivered big ideas, and they tend to be these icons, and they tend to be these torchbearers. They tend to be lighthouses as well, actually. Mm-hmm. But the story in the book that got me the most was actually the Starbucks story. Because again, you can look at it as a story of victory, and I think ultimately it is. But the real crux of the story probably happened in the fight mode, the middle mode of the whole flow of the book, where they closed 600 stores. People were not happy with their food. They made these radical things that, even when I think about that moment, I'm like, I don't know how many leaders would really have the courage to do that. And talk about that. This sort of when you have to tell the negative story, because that's an important one too.
Right, and that's one of the things that not a lot of leaders do. They want to be all buttoned up and polished all the time and not admit when things have gone wrong. And Schultz stepped in when Starbucks was in really big decline. He had to step back in and take over the CEOhood, I don't know what that's called, CEO role. And what's interesting about that, he closed some stores, which made people mad. But one of the things he also did is he knew that the people that were managing the stores were also managing the perceptions of the brand. So he did some things that were just as symbolic as they were important. And one of the things they did right away when he stepped in is he shut down all the Starbucks for 3 hours to retrain the baristas. But really, the big thing was that people would show up between 3 o'clock and 5:30 and see a note on the door that said, tomorrow you're going to get a better cup of coffee than you had today, because we're going to relearn how to make you a great cup of coffee. Right then, they're resetting in the minds of the consumers through that ceremony of retraining. We would call that a ceremony, resetting the expectations. What we were yesterday is no longer. What we're going to be tomorrow will be new. So a lot of transformation and communication is about endings and beginnings. We will not be that way, and now we're this. We're not going to do that, now we're that. And Schultz did a great job because he spent a lot of money shutting the stores. The board wasn't excited about it. The other idea he had was to take all of the store managers into New Orleans for a great big meeting. It cost $10 million. In a season where they're losing money, he decided to create a galvanizing moment where he gathered all the store managers. He had them do 10,000 hours worth of community service. services in a city that was symbolically in a state of disrepair, and Starbucks was in a state of disrepair. So he had them understand what it meant to come alongside someone that was in disrepair. And he did a beautiful job, did beautiful talks, completely regained the heart and confidence of the store managers, told incredible stories, but then he had them fall in love with coffee again. He had them roast coffee, rake coffee. He had them listen through these kiosks, listen to actual call center, and listen to conversations taped inside of Starbucks. Just listened to what they do, and really reconnecting that Starbucks is the third place. Really recommitting to that, to the where at the end he did another ceremony where there was a big commitment wall, and he had them sign this commitment wall of how they were going to behave differently when they go back home. All of those little moments, these effervescent moments, as they walked through the time at this event, really changed their mindset and changed how they perform. And that's what you need. Like the role of the communicator, you're a presenter, so you know there is the presentation itself, but how do you actually design, like in the fight, in the dream phase, you need to have a moment of inspiration. In the leap phase, you need a moment of decision. In the fight phase, you need a moment of bravery. In the climb phase, you need a moment of endurance. And in the arrival phase, you need a moment of reflection. And you got to think about it a little more broadly. It's not just about my next talk on Tuesday. It's about what do the people need? What's the moment? What's the collective moment or the collective catharsis we need to create so that they understand things are new again?
Do you worry that we can arrive at a point where, we speak to inspire others to take action, but because the speeches or these presentations become so well done, because they're listening so attentively to everything you guys do, that they're sometimes hard to deliver on? I find that happens a lot too, where people they're they have conviction, they have that true vision, but it's really hard for people to deliver on that. And there's a gap between all that great stuff and that amazing skill against what their team is actually capable of, almost.
That's interesting.
Because we use it, and the reason I'm asking, let me preface, is because we are talking about brands like Apple and Martin Luther King and Starbucks. And for some people, they're in businesses where, their bosses really have that, but just they're not, as a team, it's not being delivered.
I get that. I think that the amount of work it takes to be a refined communicator is more work than many people are willing to commit to it. And I think the great ones didn't get there by accident. They put a ton of work in it. You look at how many hours it takes you to be a concert level pianist, and if a communicator puts that kind of time into it, they will rise above the rest. And people ask me, well, who's your favorite living communicator? It's like, well, the pickings are that slim. They're very slim. Very slim. So who is going to rise up and take the crown in business and become one of the world's greatest business communicators again? Because there's an open position for that, and it would take work and it would take commitment to do it. So there is a gap. There's a good size gap, but we're hoping our body of work closes it for more than not.
So well done. I can't thank you guys enough for taking the time. It's not a book. It's like this whole thing. it's like you read a book.
You're right.
But it's like you read a book normally, and I read a lot of books. I'm like, there's like a whole lot of meat. Leave this on the side of your desk and pass it around. It's called Illuminate. It's a great book. Thanks so much for connecting again. Nancy, Patti, let people know where they can connect to the information, Illuminate, how to find you online. Go for it.
Yeah. So we are at Duarte.com. You can also get a visual executive summary of Illuminate at Duarte.com/Illuminate. Patti and I both connect to people who connect to us on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter at Nancy Duarte. She's on Twitter at Patti San. And
P-A-T-T-I-S-A-N.
P-A-T-T-I-S-A-N. And the company Twitter handle is at Duarte.
Thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thank you, Mitch. You're such a doll. You do a good job. Thanks for having us.